Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and chairman, Helga LaRouche. Today is May 13th, 2020. Helga, we've had a series of events, very successful events over the last few weeks. And in your discussions with people, you've begun to characterize the crisis by saying that we're now in the midst of the big one. There are some people who are saying, well, bigger things are still to come. But what was the basis of your assessment that we are now, with the combination of crises, we are now in the big one?
Well, I think people tend to focus on aspects of the crisis. They're either focused on the incredible economic collapse which is going on in some countries. It's really dramatic, or they focus on the coronavirus pandemic as such, or they focus on the crisis in agriculture or the threatening famine or other aspects. But I think that the only way how to look at the situation is you have to understand that what we are faced with right now is not only all of these aspects, which all obviously are part of the picture and many others, but that we are really looking at a breakdown crisis which has been in progress for at least 50 years, because that is how long Lyndon LaRouche has been warning of exactly the kind of crisis emerging now coming. And I think that we should go through the different aspects of this, but that also requires that the solution only can be one which addresses all of these crises. I mean, you have a pandemic that is for sure not under control. I think that the warnings coming both from the Senate hearing yesterday, where Professor Fauci and Redfield and various others were testifying in the Senate, where a rather incredible picture came into being, where they said very clearly that the guidelines which had been defined for so-called reopening the economy are clearly defined. There has to be for 2 weeks a shrinking of the number of infected people. There has to be ample ability for testing and contact tracing in case you have the reemergence of a hotspot. And all of these things are clearly defined, but there has been such a rush on both sides of the Atlantic in the recent weeks for so-called reopening the economy that many of these guidelines are completely neglected. So this is a very disturbing factor. We should talk about some statements by such experts as Professor Drosten in a second. Then you have the crisis of the farm sector. We are about to lose essential farm production, both in the United States and and in Europe. And you had the director of the World Food Program putting out these incredible figures that we are heading towards a global famine, and that if that is not reversed, you could have, as a consequence of the pandemic and the lockdown uh, and the collapse of agriculture as such, you could have a famine where you would have casualties of 300,000 people per day if this is not reversed. So this is quite incredible. And naturally, you have the ongoing collapse of the financial system, which definitely requires a reorganization of the entire financial system. So when I said, in various of the conferences we had over the weekend, I said, this is the big one. I was referring to actually an article by one Brigadier General Zwack, who has been serving in various functions in the US military, also as a military attaché in Moscow, who is not, he's not a, a, a dove, uh, but he's, a hardcore military man. And he said that the present pandemic is a rehearsal for the big one to come, referring to the fact that we can have other viruses and even more dramatic crises. So I said, no, the problem is that you have to look at all of these factors together, and you could have actually a chain reaction collapse into a dark age. So this, in my view, is the big one. It's the all-encompassing crisis, which definitely requires a big solution on a global scale. So this is why the Schiller Institute is presently working on a crash program to have such a global approach, which will be the basic idea that we have to stop that. We have to take the problem in its fundaments. We have to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing sector, because there is no way how we can stop this pandemic or other pandemics looming, nor can we stop the famine if we do not really reverse this absolutely Malthusian policy of keeping the developing sector in a condition of unworthy poverty and misery. And we have to have a complete reorganization of the world economy. We have to have a credit system, and we are proposing to create 1.5 billion new productive jobs, where most of these have to be in the developing sector. And that is something which needs to be discussed on a global scale. This must be taken up by responsible governments. We have been proposing since quite some time the proposal of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, that the only way how you can implement that is you have to get the most important, most powerful countries of the world together. That is the United States, China, Russia, India, supported by other countries who have important industrial capacities, such as Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, Italy. All of these countries have to mobilize their industrial capacity to solve this problem together. And there is no partial solution. Not any one nation can solve this as such. And the problem most people have is that they look at their particular situation in New York, in Berlin, in wherever they are. At best, they look at their nation. Maybe they look at their continent. But I think this is a crisis which definitely requires that we really find a solution to the problems of the entire planet. And that is the approach which we are taking.
I think one of the reasons people miss this also, besides the localism or particularism, is that they've missed a point that you've been emphasizing that was key to your husband's analysis, which is this has been ongoing for 5 decades. There have been a deliberate teardown of such things as the industrial manufacturing base in the Western countries, a collapse of public health, and so on. I mean, this is a big part of the crisis, isn't it?
Uh, yes, I think that the situation very clearly demands that we really stop thinking in terms of geopolitics, that we have to find a solution of cooperation. And you mentioned these very successful events we had over the weekend. I would really urge people to watch them. They are online. We had a very beautiful celebration of VE Day with a quite incredible discussion of the spirit of the Elbe. This was the moment when World War II ended and the Russian and Soviet and American soldiers met for the first time. And there was, for a brief moment, uh, the chance to really start a peace order in the post-war period. The soldiers had met for the first time, and they made a solemn oath, the oath of Torgau, that there should be never ever such a war again. And in this event, which we had online over the weekend, I think if people watch that, you can actually see that from the grave reflection of the losses of World War II, 60 million people died. Um, and then as the contributions of the different speakers developed, there was actually a poetical idea of friendship, of what it means to find a language together in terms of cultural exchanges. And there was also one of the veterans who spoke very, very beautifully about his life and the meaning of the writings of my husband for him. And in the end, you had the feeling we can recreate the spirit of the Elbe. We can recreate the spirit of peaceful cooperation. And I would really urge people to watch that, because that is exactly the spirit which we have to create.
And you mentioned the food crisis. There was also a very exciting discussion of farmers from Argentina, Germany, and the United States, where they discovered they all faced the same problem, namely the cartelization of the globalized food production system. Now, let's go back to the coronavirus for a moment, because you mentioned Dr. Drosten from Charité Hospital in Berlin. He has been trying to address some of the spin and scenarios and disinformation that's coming out. What has he been saying, and does this cohere with what you heard from the Senate hearings yesterday?
Yes, he addressed yesterday in his daily podcast these demonstrations, which started to take place, in many cities around the world, really, of people who oppose the present measures of lockdown, of possible vaccines, and people are quite hysterical about that, and I have all kinds of theories of why this is the case. And I think he made a point which I would urge actually people to listen to this particular podcast, that all these self-proclaimed experts, people who have even titles as doctors and professors and whatnot, claiming that they can judge this question, are completely incompetent, and that this is very dangerous, because he said the only reason why he got such a prominence is because he is not only a virologist, but he is a specialist for that particular virus, and that he would never dare to even speak about bacteria, because he knows very little about it. That for the normal person, there is not a big difference between bacteria and viruses, but that, once you really study these matters in depth, especially when you have a new virus, you really need to be competent. And these people are obviously not in the matter at all, and therefore what they spread in terms of their anti-vaccine, and sometimes, in most cases, these people have been active in the past. It's not the fact that they are now all of a sudden discovering their expertise on coronavirus, but they have been either anti-science before, or anti-vaccine, or anti-this or anti-that. He warned that the spreading of these disinformation is extremely dangerous, because this is and I know we have been accused also that we sold out, that we are paid by Bill Gates, which unfortunately is not true in the slightest. Not unfortunately, I wouldn't take money from this guy anyhow. But this is all really contributing that the infection will go up. And, I mean, this is really a very, very serious matter. It's an unprecedented crisis. There's not yet much known about this virus. There are new, very disturbing factors. For example, the much scolded WHO just, in my view, put out an absolute correct warning how irresponsible it is to talk about herd immunity. I have said that from the beginning, that human beings are not a herd. We are not animals. We can't apply such categories to the human species. And in the country where it was applied, namely in Sweden, you have an extremely high ratio of elderly people who died. And this was absolutely not necessary uh, if you would have applied the measures otherwise prescribed. Then you have the phenomena that there is now clear that a strange phenomena among children has emerged. In New York, 85 children showed symptoms very much like coronavirus. They test positive, but there are also other factors which are up to now unexplained. Then you have the funny, or not so funny, but the strange situation that the highest infection rate and I think, you know, also death rate in the United States is the people between 35 and 55. All of this, according to the other figures, does not apply. So is this a strain mutating? Is it new strains? Um, then you have the situation that in Wuhan, where they had a complete lockdown and could eliminate the infection altogether. Now 6 new cases have appeared. And what does the Chinese government do? They are going to test 11 million people in the next week, just everybody in the city of Wuhan. So, I just want, and naturally the crisis is now really emerging in the developing countries, where the ILO, the International Labour Organization, published these figures that of the 3.3 billion uh, labor places in the world, 2 billion, that is 60%, are so-called informal labor. Now, that means these people are living from the hand in the mouth. They have no social benefits, they have no insurance, they mostly have no money to be treated, so they are completely dependent on government programs, but the governments in many cases don't have the means. And if you're talking about informal economy, this is you know I have been in many developing countries, and I can tell you, for example, in the realm of agriculture, an informal uh, job means you have one goat and you have an entire family sitting on a mini plot of land around that goat, and that is their livelihood. So you're talking about conditions where people don't have clean water, they don't have electricity, so they can't even fulfill the hygiene measures which are requested. So this thing is not under control. And I can only say that the indifference towards the suffering of the developing countries is, in my view, disqualifying the people who are now raving and raging, saying, this is all a plot. I mean, the reality is that we are looking at the possible mass deaths of hundreds of millions of people. And that alone should be a moral outcry that we have to change the system, because if we don't, we are not morally fit to survive ourselves in the so-called advanced sector, which now it turns out, and that was clear for a long time, is not so advanced at all.
And one of the things that's reemerging in the background that's been off the front pages recently, but never went away, is the idea of the green economy. There are people who are saying, isn't it wonderful that so much industry is shut down because the animals are coming back to the cities and water is clean and on and on. But in the last couple of days, leading industrialists in Europe have come out with a crazy proposal for moving ahead with the green economy. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there is obviously a push by the Confindustria, the BDI, and the Industrial Association in France to go for big investment programs. And actually, that is what is required. But I mean, this is a moment where, when they call for the implementation of the EU Green Deal, that will mean that on an already practically, a really completely weakened economy, where the industrial collapse is really significant. For example, there is an Italian think tank which just put out figures, and in Italy, the industrial production from the beginning of the year until April collapsed by 61%. Now that is not peanuts. And that explains why people are getting so absolutely uh, freaked out about their livelihood, the future, and so forth. But if you then superimpose on such a collapsed economy a green deal economy, you are basically shutting down these countries as industrial nations. And that absolutely must be prevented, because, as I said earlier, if you want to overcome the crisis, especially in Africa, Latin America, Asia, but you also have pockets of where you really have deep, deep poverty. Then you have the whole refugee crisis. In Lampedusa, you have more and more refugees coming from Libya. You have the horrible situation in the Greek islands. All of these situations must be taken as one. And in order to solve that, you need the industrialization of Southwest Asia, of Africa, of Latin America. And for that, you need the economies of Italy, of France, of Germany, and other so-called industrialized countries. And we have to go back to physical economy. We have to go back to the idea that you need an increase of energy flux density. You need to have emphasis on scientific breakthroughs of new physical principles. You have to increase the productivity of the economy. And all of these principles you can really find in the economic theories of my late husband. And that is going to be the basis of the world program, which we are going to publish in a relatively short period of time.
Now, one other aspect of the big one that you're talking about is the march toward war, which continues with statements coming from key figures in the United States, including Peter Navarro, who's involved in the trade negotiations, Secretary of State Pompeo, vicious attacks on China. And at the same time, you have the argument for the freedom of naval operations, whether it's the South China Sea or the Barents Sea. This can be extremely dangerous at a moment where cooperation is needed, and instead you have these unleashed war hawks.
Yeah, I would say that, it's very clear that the people surrounding President Trump did not have such an impulse at the beginning of his administration. He went to China. Xi Jinping came to his private place in Mar-a-Lago, and it was all on a good track. But now with the it started to go wrong with the so-called tariff negotiations, the trade war. But now we are basically from certain quarters in the military-industrial complex comes this idea that China is an enemy, an opponent, a competitor, but really going up to the level of an enemy. And then you have people like Pompeo saying that there is an enormous amount of evidence that the virus was spread deliberately by China, which is an unbelievable statement. He has not provided any proof. It's basically that the China gate is replacing Russia gate. And people should, remind themselves that the whole Russia gate was a complete flop. The Mueller investigation was a complete disaster. And now you have with the declassification of the testimony of former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, it comes out very clearly. The entire heads of intelligence knew there was no evidence against Russia and against Trump. They were lying through their teeth. Obama was in the middle of it. This thing has collapsed, and now the confrontation against China has replaced Russiagate. And it's coming from the same people, namely, the British Anglophile circles, the British government, the British Secret Service, the Anglophiles in the United States. But it's very dangerous. I think it's very upsetting because China has done very well. They communicated with their colleague scientists. This is provable. There are now more scientists speaking out that that was the case. There are also more scientists speaking out saying that the accusation that China produced this virus in a laboratory is scientifically completely unproven and wrong. It emerged so-called naturally from a species jump. And, it is really, I think people really have to argue against that because this is the drumbeat for an enemy image for a potential war. And I think anybody who repeats this lie is making themselves guilty of having contributed to the potential danger of war. If you take the anti-China propaganda, which plays on the fact that people unfortunately know very little about China. They know very little about the Chinese culture, the Chinese history. If they would know these things, they wouldn't say such foolish things. But every journalist and every politician who is, blowing into this horn makes himself or herself guilty of being a warmonger, with the implication that it can go completely wrong and end up in World War III. So there should be absolutely no sympathy with that. I think what is needed is what I said earlier. If you want to solve this gigantic problem of the entire human species, which has many aspects, you need the collaboration of the most important countries, especially the two largest economies of the world, the United States and China, must work together. And then naturally the other industrial countries must join in. So I can only say, we should denounce the warmongers. They are as guilty as the people who were advertising, the total war in the Second World War. So there's no less guilt for them.
And just to come back to the Russiagate for a second, you mentioned the Flynn case, the exposure, the FBI corruption in that, but also the release of these interviews that were done by the Adam Schiff Intelligence Committee. Two things really stand out. Clapper, among others, who has never stopped saying Russia was collaborating, was conspiring to elect Trump. When he was under oath in the committee, he said he had no evidence that there was collusion. So when he's a paid broadcaster for CNN or MSNBC, he lies like crazy. But under oath, he admitted there was no evidence of collusion. But even more striking, because we've made a big deal out of this, was that there's no evidence of Russian hacking. And this came from the CEO of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, who admitted that they had no concrete evidence, and they are the only ones who had access to the computers of the DNC. This is not getting reported very widely, but I think it's extremely important because it shows that the relations between the US and Russia were destroyed by these kinds of lies. And now they're trying to do the same thing with China. I just wonder if you have any more thoughts on that.
No, but I think that this is now coming out, and Flynn is basically rehabilitated. There's even rumors that he may be reinstalled in his previous position. I don't know if there's any credibility to that, but would be good. Um, but I think, in the aftermath, one can only hope that there will be a follow-up and that the culprits will be brought to justice, because this is what is necessary. Because if they are not brought to justice, they keep going. And, as I said before, what was Russia before is now China. So these people have to be brought to justice.
And now we come to something that I think you're quite interested in, the Karlsruhe German Constitutional Court ruling, which has completely turned the European Union and the European Central Bank upside down with the statement that there are still national interests which take precedence over the policies of the bureaucrats of Brussels. There's been a lot of commentary about this the last couple of days. Where do things stand on this Constitutional Court ruling?
Well, I think this is one of the better developments, because, as you say, the Constitutional Court of Germany reasserted that Germany is still a sovereign country, at least in aspects, and that the supranational institutions like the European Court of Justice have not total power over the fate of what happens to the German economy and workplace and taxpayers and savings and so forth. So I think this is very good. The freak out on the side of the EU, especially EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who is now threatening to sue Germany. Can you imagine that? That just proves that these supranational bureaucrats are what used to be called a German Vaterlandslose Gesellen, that they have no country they are loyal to, but they are like the Holy Alliance, where the oligarchy just serves their own interest. But as one of the members of the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, Peter Huber, he pointed out, he said, that as long as there is not a European people, there cannot be a European Court of Justice which has total power. And that's the point. And it's also not mentioned, but the case that, for example, the respective constitutional courts of Denmark and Czech Republic previously already challenged the superiority of the European Court of Justice. So this has to be played out, but for the meantime, it means that the German national the Bundesbank basically has no obligation to continue to participate in these bailout schemes by the EZB, and that it's the responsibility of the German government and the German parliament to see, what are the side effects of these programs on the victims, like the people who have savings. So I think this is one more nail in the coffin of this supranational structure, EU Commission and ECB, who are clearly not in the interest of the member states. And that has been a growing perception in any case in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in other countries. But now it's clear that there is also a fundamental rift evolving between Germany and this supranational structure. So that basically, the arrogant behavior, which was portrayed by Lagarde and von der Leyen, they are really overdoing it. And by basically saying that they are the masters of the universe, this was a formulation used by Peter Huber, they are really stretching it, and they may just overstretch it. So I think this is a moment where we have to go back to principles of how the economy functioned when it was doing well. I think in Germany, for example, a reference point for sure is the German economic miracle. This was a period where we got out of a tremendous destruction of the end of World War II, and within a few years, the German economy could be brought back to a boom, which was admired in the whole world, the German economic miracle. This was very much similar to principles of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. And these are the principles which we now need to revive to deal with this crisis. So that is what the Schiller Institute is fighting for. We will have more internet conferences. I would like you to join the Schiller Institute. This is a moment where you should not sit on the fence, but you should become part of a worldwide mass movement for a just new world economic order and a cultural renaissance of classical art and culture.
And just to add to that in closing, I think those of you who have been watching for the last half hour realize that what Helga is presenting each week is not just unique analysis, but even breaking news stories which are not being covered in your local media. It's crucial that this webcast get out to more people. And those of you who are watching it, who are regulars, organize your friends, organize others to watch and tune in and become part of the Schiller Institute. But use these weekly webcasts as a means to organize your own thinking and your own activity. So with that, Helga, anything further you have to add?
Well, I just think that people have to have a sense that there is a solution. I understand that it's very difficult. The being locked down, home office, having difficult conditions, not knowing where the future will be, what it will be like. These are all extremely challenging, situations. But I can only tell you that there are solutions. We have been working for that for 50 years. If people would have listened to the warnings of Lyndon LaRouche in these decades, they would not be surprised, because he has said many, many times that there will be a collapse of the system, that this system is completely unsavable, that there will be pandemics, and that is where we are now. So we have been preparing for that in a certain sense for half a century. But there is also a solution, because my husband also said there is no need for anybody to be out of work, because the land bridge gives the opportunity for everybody to have a productive job. And the program which we published, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, is actually the blueprint. So we will make an update on that, and we will publish that. So I would like you to be active, distribute and sign our petition for a World Health Program, a World Food Program, which we will have on the website in a day or two, and join our movement and help us to succeed, because there is a solution, but it needs a lot of people helping to implement it.
Okay, Helga, thank you for that, and I'll see you again next week.
Till next week.